Frost had worked itself into the cracks of the floorboards of the Holloway farmhouse. The winter Willa Croft turned 23, and no amount of fire in the hearth seemed to drive it out. For 4 years, the people of Dunmore's Crossing had heard things in the night. Heavy things. They had heard the particular silence that follows them, and they had gone back to sleep. Dunmore's Crossing sat at the bruised edge of northern Ontario, the kind of place that the Canadian Shield had swallowed so completely that even the road in felt like a reluctant concession. The town had a grain elevator, a hardware store, a Legion Hall, and a church whose congregation prayed loudly on Sundays and pretended very hard the rest of the week. In winter, the cold came off Lake Neve with a cruelty that felt personal. The birches went white, and the sky went the color of old pewter, and the whole world contracted to the space between your front door and your woodpile. Willa had grown up an hour north of there, a trapper's daughter with raw-knuckled hands and a laugh that her mother said could spook a moose out of the bush. She had been quick at figures and quicker at reading, and the schoolteacher, Mrs. Archambault, had told her father that the girl had a mind worth cultivating. Her father, Henry Croft, had nodded and said nothing useful about it, because by then he owed 6 months of back payments on 3 different lines of credit, and Declan Holloway had just walked into the diner on a Thursday morning and sat across from Henri, and ordered 2 coffees without being asked. Declan Holloway was 41 years old, and he owned the only equipment rental company between Dunmore's Crossing and the provincial highway, which meant every farmer and contractor in that valley needed something from him at least twice a year. He owned the building that housed the pharmacy. He sat on the board of the credit union. He was broad through the chest and kept his gray-shot hair close-cropped, and he had a way of listening to a man talk that made the man feel thoroughly understood. Before he quite realized he had agreed to something. He had looked at Willa once, at a Canada Day bonfire the summer she was 19, and the look had lasted a half-second too long, and then Declan Holloway had turned back to Henry Croft and said, very quietly, that he thought they might be able to work something out regarding the debt situation. The wedding was in September, at the church, with 12 people in the pews. Willa had worn her mother's dress, altered, and had carried a bouquet of late-season asters that her friend Brid Tansey had picked from the field behind the post office. Brid had squeezed her hand before she walked down the aisle, and Willa had squeezed back, and neither of them had said anything because there was nothing sensible to say. The first time Declan hit her, it was 3 weeks into the marriage, over a pot of coffee she had let go too long on the stove. Not a slap. A closed fist against the side of her head, fast and deliberate, the way a man swats something he finds irritating. The ringing in her left ear lasted 4 days. She told herself it was an aberration. She told herself he was under pressure. She told herself a great many things that winter, in the way that a person builds a small, necessary shelter out of whatever materials are closest to hand. By spring, she had stopped telling herself anything. She had simply learned the grammar of the house. She learned that the creak of the second porch step meant he was home, and that the number of seconds between creak and the door handle told her what kind of home he was coming to. She learned that the rental season brought a particular strain of resentment that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with her. She learned that the bruises on her forearms could be covered by the cuffs of her flannel shirts, and that the ones along her ribs could be covered by everything. She learned that Dr. Masson at the clinic on Rivard Street had a way of writing down what she said and then closing the file without meeting her eyes, and that this meant he had made a decision she was not party to. Declan was not a man who lost his temper in public. He saved it, the way you might save a good piece of wood for the right project, and he spent it at home with a craftsman's economy. He never left marks above the collar. He was known at the Legion as a man who stood around and told a decent story and knew how to make a room laugh. People liked him. People found him reliable. The accounts manager at the credit union, a woman named Sandra Turk, once said to Willa over the counter at the post office that she didn't know what Willa had done to deserve a man like Declan, but she hoped Willa knew how lucky she was. Willa had said she did know. She had been saying variations of this for 4 years. The worst of it was the town itself. Dunmore's Crossing was not large enough for anyone to be ignorant, and not small enough for anyone to feel responsible. Her nearest neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Forsberg, had once found her sitting on the back steps in November with no coat on, staring at the tree line, and he had stood with her for a moment, and then gone inside and come back with a cup of tea and set it beside her, and gone away again, and that was the closest anyone in that town had ever come to asking. By the 4th winter, Willa had begun to think about the lake, not in the way a person thinks about a pleasant thing. In the way a person thinks about a door they are not sure they have the courage to walk through, or the cowardice, or whatever it was. The ice on Lake Neve went 3 feet deep by February, and she had found herself on it twice, just standing there in the gray morning, before Declan woke up, looking at the place where the ice changed color and thinking. It was the night of the first hard freeze of that 4th December that everything broke. Declan had driven back from a site consultation in Cochrane, 4 hours away, and whatever had gone wrong there had come home with him in the cab of his truck like a third passenger. Willa knew it the moment she heard the diesel engine shut off. She knew it from the silence before the door. She stood up from the kitchen table and she thought, with a clarity she did not expect, that she was very tired. Not frightened. Just tired, the way a thing is tired that has been bent too many times in the same place. He came in without taking his boots off, which was always a signal. What happened in the next 40 minutes left her on the kitchen floor with 2 cracked ribs, a split across her left brow that kept filling her left eye with blood no matter how hard she pressed her hand to it, and her right wrist bent in a direction that made her feel ill to look at. She lay still after he'd gone up the stairs. She could hear the shower running. She lay on the cold linoleum, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about the ice on the lake with a strange and terrible longing. And then she thought about something else instead, something she could not have named, but that felt very distantly like refusal. She did not go to the lake. She pulled herself up by the counter lip and wrapped her wrist against her chest and walked out the back door in her socked feet into the snow. She made it to the county road before her legs stopped working properly. She sat in the ditch, in 3 feet of blown snow, in the dark, and the temperature was dropping through -20, and she could feel her socks already soaking through. The sky above the spruce trees was indifferent and enormous and full of stars. She pressed her wrist to her chest and breathed in short pulls and thought, with a kind of distant practicality, that she might die here in this ditch if she didn't make a decision about what she was going to do. She did not hear him coming until he was nearly on top of her. He was not coming from the road. He was coming from the bush line, which was how she didn't hear the crunch of boots on snow until it was too late to startle properly. She looked up and saw a shape that her cold, addled brain first registered as a very large animal before it resolved into a man. A very large man, carrying a pack frame loaded with what appeared to be trapping supplies, wearing a canvas Filson jacket so heavy used it had gone the color of creek mud, his face half obscured by a balaclava pulled down to his beard. He stopped when he saw her. She didn't move. "You fall," he said. His voice was flat and factual, and had the particular quality of someone fun who did not use it often enough to bother with inflection. "No," Willa said. He looked at her wrist and then at the blood running out of her eyebrow, which she had stopped noticing because it was frozen to her cheek. He did not say anything about what he was looking at. He unslung the pack frame and set it in the snow and crouched down to her level. "Can you walk?" "I could," she said. "I don't know where." He was quiet for a moment. He looked up the county road and then back toward the dark mass of the bush, and then he looked at her with eyes that were a light, weathered brown and entirely steady. "There's a camp," he said. 20 minutes through the trees. You won't make it in socks. He pulled a pair of wool boot liners out of the top of his pack. He handed them to her without ceremony. She put them on. He helped her to her feet with a grip that was careful in a way she was not expecting, and she thought absurdly of the way you hold a bird you've found stunned on the ground. His name was August Vey. She didn't learn that until they were inside the camp. A trapper's cabin set back off the bush trail that she would never have found on her own, with a barrel stove that he had going in under 4 minutes and a lantern hung from a crossbeam that threw everything amber. He said his name, the way he said everything, without decoration, as though words were a currency he'd learned to spend carefully. "Willa," she said, and he nodded and went to his pack and found a clean cloth and a bottle of something clear and medicinal. "Your wrist is broken," he said. He was not asking. He had looked at it the same way you look at a fence post that's gone over and you know immediately what happened to it. "I know," she said. "I can set it. It'll hurt." She looked at him across the small space of the cabin. He was somewhere north of 50, she thought, with the kind of face that hard life outdoors makes, not old but thoroughly weathered, a jaw like a quarried thing under a dark graying beard. His hands were enormous and scarred across the knuckles, and he held them very still while he waited for her answer. "All right," she said. It did hurt. She did not make a sound. Afterward she sat with her arms splinted and bound, and her hands wrapped around a cup of tea he had made from a tin of red rose he kept on a shelf beside his fire kit, and she felt something she did not have a word for. Not safe, exactly. She had stopped believing in safe as a permanent condition. Something more like the first breath you take after being underwater. She slept there that night, on a cot against the far wall, under 2 wool blankets. August Vey slept sitting up in the chair by the stove, and she understood this as a deliberate act of courtesy, and she was grateful for it in a way she could not have expressed. In the morning she woke to the smell of wood smoke and bacon grease and the sound of an axe somewhere outside, and for 4 full seconds she did not know where she was. And then she did, and she lay still for a moment longer, counting those 4 seconds like something precious. She could not go back. She knew this the way you know a structural thing, the way a wall knows it's the wall. She had known it for a long time and had simply been unable to make the knowledge mean anything actionable. Now it meant something. She also knew that Declan Holloway would not let her go. He would frame her absence as a crisis. He would call it a breakdown. He would speak to people in that reasonable, level voice, and he would have her brought back inside a week, because he had done it before. 3 years earlier, she had driven herself to the Women's Resource Office in Hearst, a 90-minute drive. And the woman behind the desk, whose name she had forgotten, though she had been very kind, had been helping her fill out a safety plan when Declan walked through the front door. She never understood how he knew where she was. She understood later that he had simply driven to every possible destination until he found the right one. He was methodical. That had always been the most frightening thing about him. August came in from outside and pulled the balaclava off and hung it on a peg. He looked at her and asked her if she wanted more tea. "He'll come," she said. "The man who did this, he'll come looking." August poured water from the kettle into the cup. He did not appear surprised by this information. "How long do you need?" he said. She looked at him. The question was simple, and she did not know what to do with it, the way you don't know what to do with something you haven't been offered in a long time. "I don't know what I need," she said honestly. "I need to not go back. That's a start," he said, and handed her the tea. She stayed. The weeks that followed had the compressed, clarifying quality of deep winter in the bush, where everything unnecessary falls away because survival doesn't have room for it. Her ribs knit, and her wrist knit, and the gash above her eye closed into a thin, pale line. She learned the rhythms of the camp. August ran a trap line that went 12 kilometers into the Crown Land, north of the camp. He was gone first light to early afternoon, most days, and in his absence Willa chopped wood, badly at first and then better, and she kept the stove, and she patched a section of the roof where the shakes had sprung, and she found that her hands remembered how to do useful things. In the evenings, by the stove, they talked, not the way people talk who are performing warmth at each other. The way people talk who have a lot of quiet inside them and have found, unexpectedly, that some of it can be let out without loss. She learned that he had come to the bush the year his marriage ended, 15 years prior, and had found that the bush suited him better than the city ever had, and that he did not miss much about the life he'd left. He had a daughter in Timmins who called him on a satellite phone once a month, and about whom he spoke with a pride so understated it took Willa 2 weeks to recognize it as pride. He learned about her father's debts, and the September wedding, and the 9 years she had spent in that house on the county road learning the grammar of a man's violence. He listened the way very still people listen, completely, without filling in the spaces. "You didn't have anywhere," he said once. It was not an accusation, it was just an observation, the way he observed that the wind was shifting east or the creek ice was thinning. A fact he was noting precisely. "No," she said, "I didn't." He had nodded and put another piece of birch on the fire, and that was all he said, and somehow it was more than anyone else had managed in 4 years. Declan Holloway had not been idle. He had called the OPP station in Dunmore's Crossing on the first morning and reported his wife as missing, a vulnerable person, a woman who had been experiencing significant emotional difficulties. He had been very concerned. The constable who took the report, a young man named Constable Rourke, had driven out to the farmhouse and spoken to Declan for 40 minutes in the kitchen and driven away again. And this was the entirety of the official investigation for the first week. The second week, Declan began speaking to people in the way he did when he was managing a narrative. He went to the Legion, and he went to the hardware store, and he sat with Sandra Turk at the credit union, and he said, with a heaviness that communicated deep marital suffering, that Willa had not been well. That there had been difficulties he hadn't felt right sharing publicly. That she had needed help he hadn't known how to give her, that he was just praying she was somewhere safe and warm. The third week, he hired someone. His name was Rory Finch, and he was from a private security firm out of Sudbury with a side business in domestic retrieval, which was not a service advertised on their website, but which existed nonetheless. Finch was a former bailiff with a large frame and a practical mind, and no particular interest in anybody's personal history. Declan offered him a number that made the trip worth his while. Spring came in hard that year, the way it does in northern Ontario. Not gradually, but in a single decisive week, when the temperature swings 20 degrees, and the snow turns gray and starts to liquor, and the rivers go violent with melt. The bush became navigable to people who knew it less well. Willa had learned by then how to skin a rabbit without wasting the pelt. She had learned how to read the pressure in a snare set. She had learned that a 30-30 Winchester, which was what August kept on the rack beside the door, had a kick that she needed to lean into rather than away from, and that once you knew how to lean into it, it was manageable. She had put 300 rounds through it over the course of February and March. August had watched her without comment for the first 50, and then adjusted her stance twice, briefly, and after that watched her with something that she was fairly sure, knowing him now, was satisfaction. She was not waiting to be collected. She was not waiting for anything. She was becoming something she could not name yet, but that felt, underneath her hands when she held the rifle, like bedrock. The morning they came, the ice on the creek had just begun to crack. She was splitting wood in the clearing when she heard the snowmobile. Not August's machine, which had a particular note she knew by now. Something larger, and coming from the south, from the road, which meant someone had found the access trail. She set the axe down. She went inside and she stood by the window, and she watched the tree line. 2 men came out of the bush on foot, having left the machine somewhere back on the trail. Finch she did not know. The other one she would have known in any light, in any weather, at any distance. The particular set of the shoulders, the way he moved through the world as though it owed him passage. Declan Holloway had come to collect his property. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the cabin. She could see from the window that he was doing the same thing he always did when he arrived, somewhere he hadn't been before, cataloging it, pricing it. Then he looked toward the door and he smiled in the way he smiled when he was about to be very reasonable. Finch had his hand on something under his jacket. She noted this. "Willa," Declan called across the clearing. His voice was even, almost gentle. The voice he used in public. "I know you're in there. Come on out. We'll talk." She stood at the window and she did not move. "Willa," less gentle now, the voice dropping into the register she knew, the one that came just before. "You have done enough. You have embarrassed yourself, and embarrassed me, and it is time to come home." She heard the door of the cabin open behind her, which meant August had come back from the south end of the line, because the south end was where the big beaver sets were, and sometimes he was back early from the south end. She heard his boots on the plank floor. She heard him stop. There was a silence in which she understood that he had seen the two men in the clearing through the window and assessed the situation and was now standing still behind her waiting. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Declan. "You should go," she said to August. Her voice was very steady. She was surprised by it. "This doesn't have to be your problem." "I know it doesn't," August said. He did not move from where he was standing. She did look at him then. He was looking at the two men in the clearing with the same level expression with which he looked at everything, the broken fence post, the shifted wind, the fact of the thing that had to be dealt with. "I'm not going," she said to the window, to Declan. Her own voice was still steady, and she understood now that this was because she had made the decision before she knew she was making it. Somewhere over the previous 3 months, in the woodpile and the rifle range and the long evenings beside the stove, she had made it. "I am not coming back, not to that house, not to that town, not to any of it." "You don't have a choice," Declan said, and he began walking across the clearing. Finch moved with him, hand still under the jacket. She reached behind her to the rack beside the door, and she took down the Winchester. She worked the lever once, which loaded the chamber, and she stepped out the cabin door into the March air, and she raised the rifle to her shoulder, and she let out her breath, and she did not point it at Declan. She pointed it at the ground 2 feet in front of him. Declan stopped. He was 15 meters away, close enough for her to see his face clearly, the particular expression that crossed it when something was not obeying the expected sequence. She had spent 4 years learning to read that expression from the inside of it. It was different, reading it from the outside. Smaller, he looked like what he was, a man who relied on closed doors and unopposable force, and who had found that the doors were open and the force was not, in fact, unopposable. Finch had gone very still. He was calculating something. She could see him doing it. "I'd move my hand away from whatever that is," August said from the doorway behind her. He had the old Remington he used for bear that he kept separate from the rifle rack, and it was in his hands, and he was not pointing it at anyone, but the way he was holding it communicated a very clear piece of information about the direction in which the conversation should go. Finch moved his hand away from his jacket and held both hands in a quiet and deliberate way. "This is assault," Declan said. His voice had gone sharp and thin. "This is illegal confinement. This man has held you here, Willa. I know that, and I want you to know that whatever he's told you, you are not safe here, you are." "Declan," she said. He stopped. "I know what I am," she said. "For the first time in quite a while, I know exactly what I am. I need you to hear me. I am not going with you. I am going to lower this rifle when you turn around and walk back the way you came. And after that, I am going to contact a lawyer and begin the dissolution of our marriage through legal channels. And if you come back onto this land again, I will be calling the OPP. And this time, I will not be the one telling them things are fine." Something shifted in Declan Holloway's face. It was not remorse. She did not expect remorse, and she did not see it. It was recalculation. The realization that something that had always gone a certain way had, in this particular iteration, gone a different way. That the equation had changed. The variables were not what they had been. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at August Vey in the doorway with the Remington. He looked at Finch, who was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has decided that this particular piece of work is not worth the particular fee. Declan turned around and walked back across the clearing and into the tree line. Finch followed him. She heard the snowmobile start. She heard it diminish to the south. She stood in the clearing with the Winchester at her side for a long time after the sound was gone. The March sky above the spruce was a pale and washed-out blue, and the creek at the bottom of the slope was making the cracking sounds it made when the ice was deciding to let go. A gray jay landed on the fence post at the edge of the clearing and looked at her for a moment with its bright, assessing eye, and then flew off into the timber. She did what she had promised she would do. She found a lawyer in Timmins, a woman named Carol Ningaiwan, who had handled enough Northern Ontario cases to know what 4 years of carefully located bruises looked like in an affidavit. Carol Ningaiwan was not a person who was surprised by much, and she was not surprised by Willa. She was thorough, and she was very good at her job, and what emerged from her work over the following 8 months was a legal process that Declan Holloway's reputation could not contain or redirect. The people of Dunmore's Crossing learned, one by one, in the way small towns learn things, what had gone on inside that farmhouse on the county road, what it sounded like from outside, what it had looked like to Dr. Masson, who had written things in files and closed them, and who now said nothing publicly because there was nothing he could say that would help him. Sandra Turk, at the credit union, did not say anything either. Constable Rourke, who had spent 40 minutes with Declan in that kitchen on the first morning, applied for a transfer to another posting. Brid Tansey, who had picked the asters and squeezed Willa's hand at the church door on the September morning, drove up to the camp one Sunday in June with her sister's truck full of supplies, and did not say "I knew," or "I should have," or "I'm sorry," but held Willa for a long time in the clearing, and then helped carry things inside, and Willa understood this as the apology and received it as such. The marriage was dissolved in October. The farmhouse went to cover the legal costs Declan could not contest. He left Dunmore's Crossing that winter, and the equipment rental company was purchased by a man from Kapuskasing, who was unremarkable in all the ordinary ways, and whose trucks showed up when they were supposed to. The camp at the timberline was small, and the winter was long, and there were 2 people in it now, instead of 1. They did not call it anything, the thing that had grown between them in the amber light of the lantern, and the long evenings beside the stove. They didn't need to. Out here, you learned to trust what the land showed you plainly, without the need for naming. In the spring, a package arrived, forwarded through August's daughter in Timmins. Inside was a sketchbook and a set of graphite pencils. The note said only, "For the things you see out there," and it was signed with Brid's handwriting, cramped and looping and unmistakable. Willa sat on the step of the cabin in the May sun, which was warm and thin and genuine in the way that northern spring sun always is, earned by everything that came before it. She opened the sketchbook to the first page. Outside, a creek that had been ice was running clear and fast over clean rock. The birches were coming back. The gray jays were doing what gray jays do, which is to say being frank and curious and entirely unimpressed by hardship. She pressed the pencil to the page. She began.